Good evening and welcome. I'm Maria Castelluccio, the head of Lamont Manhattan. As you may know, we're an independent school that serves children from 16 months to grade 12. I'm happy to see so many of our Lamont family here this evening, and I also welcome the many families and educators all over Manhattan that are joining us for this special evening. Having been in education for more than 30 years, leading schools in the public, private, and international sectors, I have engaged in conversations with thousands of families and students, all the while raising my own 4 children. And what I heard was, no matter the age, the gender, the race, religion, cultural background, the one common theme that was raised over and over again was the well-being of our children. And that well-being includes the mind, the body, and the spirit. As parents and educators, we know that the emotional and social well-being of our children is the foundation for their success in whatever endeavors they choose to participate in, whether that's academic, a creative process, or their social interactions and relationships. We also know that at this moment in time, there are unique pressures that our young people are facing that can jeopardize that well-being. At Lamont, we continuously look for opportunities for staff and families to engage in conversations that are current and relevant and meet the needs of our community. And when we recently surveyed our parents about what are the topics that they would like to learn more about, the overwhelming response from families from all divisions, whether it was a parent of age 3 or 16, was not about increasing GPA or becoming a more successful mathematician or reader, albeit all of those are important. It was wanting more information about how to create mental health and well-being for our children in today's world. And that's because we know that mental and social emotional well-being for our children is where it all begins. We are thrilled to be hosting this important conversation openly and honestly so that ultimately we can do better and be better for our children who are our future. So tonight we will engage in a discussion with an impressive and knowledgeable panel. We thank them for being with us tonight, and there will be time for your questions to be addressed by the panel. So at this time, I invite the panel up to the stage, please. Our moderator for the evening is Anya Kamenetz, who is an educational correspondent from NPR. Anya joined NPR in 2014 and has been part of their award-winning team of journalists covering education. She is the author of several books focused on screen time and technology, student loans, and higher education access and quality. Prior to NPR, Anya covered technology, innovation, sustainability, and social entrepreneurship for 5 years at Fast Company, and she has contributed to educational coverage for the New York Times, the Washington Post, New York Magazine, and the Slate. Please join me in welcoming Anya and our entire panel this evening.
Thank you so much for putting together this incredible event, and thank you all for coming here for this important conversation. I don't want to editorialize. I want to get us right to this panel. I just have a short observation, which is that we're here to talk about something that's very scary, very upsetting, but what I learned in my time in media is that nothing changes until we start to pay attention to it. And so many of the things that are so disturbing in the world around us, what's most disturbing is actually the silence. And so we see this so much with mental health, that the conversation about it may be painful, but it's not as painful as the time when we didn't talk about it. And so I hope we can locate that hope as well as the many sobering things we're going to be sharing tonight. So I'm joined by Cynthia Germanata, the president and co-founder of the Born This Way Foundation, along with Maya Anista Smith, her executive director. To their left is Dr. Jeffrey Gardere, and he is a clinical psychologist and associate professor at Touro College of Osteopathic Medicine. And then is Kelli Posner. She's a founder and director of Columbia University's Lighthouse Project. Jane Clemente is the Chief Executive Officer of the Tyler Clemente Foundation, and Adam Gonzalez, the Founding Director of Stony Brook University's Mind Body Clinical Research Center. So we have clinicians, we have advocates, people with personal experience, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves a little bit more and also answer the question that's uppermost in my mind, which is, do we truly have a crisis when it comes to young people's mental health in this country? You can certainly make a case in the numbers, but do you see a crisis unfolding? And if so, what is at the heart of that crisis?
Thank you, Anya. Yeah, and hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Hopefully so. As Anya said, I'm Cynthia Germanata, president and co-founder of Born This Way Foundation, which I co-founded with my daughter, Stephanie, who many of you may know as Lady Gaga. And the reason we exist is her. This is a very personal story to our family and to her, and it's based on the struggles that she experienced as a young child growing up that led to depression in middle school that subsequently has stayed with her for many, many years. And it's her desire that young people feel and be better equipped than she was to deal with their struggles. And that's at the heart of our foundation. We work every day to inspire and empower young people to create a world that's kinder and braver, and at the core of that is really their mental health. In terms of the question, I almost don't think it's a question. There is absolutely a crisis around mental health. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among youth ages 14 to 24, and the biggest deterrent to youth getting help is they don't know where to go. We do a lot of research in our foundation. 9 out of 10 young people prioritize their mental health. They really do want to feel better and be better, but they don't know where to go, they don't have quality access to resources, and they don't feel educated on it. So that's where we spend a great deal of our time.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Maya Smith, and I have the incredible privilege of serving as the executive director of Lady Gaga's Born This Way Foundation. Our work has 3 main goals. The first is to make kindness cool. The second is to validate the emotions of young people around the world. And the third is to eliminate the stigma around mental health. I think Anya said it best. I actually would slightly disagree with Cynthia and say the crisis is in the silence around mental health. It's in the stigma, right? We wouldn't say like X number of more first graders, I have a first grader and a kindergartner, broke their legs this year, right? And not in any way to compare the gravity of that, but what we have is we have a lack of access to resources, a lack of education and awareness and modeling the conversations that we need to have in order to reduce the stigma. Cynthia and I just came from an hour-long conversation with 30 of some of the most incredible students here in the school, some of your kids, and we had an incredible conversation. What I can tell you is that there is hope, there is solutions, there is resilience, there is bravery, and there is a desire to not only survive, but to thrive. And I'm extremely, extremely hopeful that the solutions to all of the crises that we're facing right now are contained within those 30 young people and inside your families.
That's wonderful. Hi, my name is Jeff Gardere, and I like Lady Gaga's recordings with Tony Bennett.
That's great.
But I really do love all her music, and the fact that she talks about her mental health struggles, and I think that's part of what we really need to see. It's the way that we smash that stigma is to talk about what our own challenges, I don't always say mental health illness, but what our mental health challenges happen to be. That would help in getting rid of that stigma. But in addition to teaching behavioral medicine at the Truro College of Osteopathic Medicine, I'm also an executive director of a large mental health agency in the tri-state area where I work with many, many young people. I've also written several parenting books, one with Montel Williams. So very much tuned into what's going on in addition to my own 6 children. I'm like the old man in the shoe. I have so many kids, I don't know what to do. But I think it's really important. I think one of the major issues that we're running into is what's happening with our kids with social media. In many ways, look, social media is a great thing. The internet is a great thing, but sometimes too much of a great thing is an issue, especially when we don't have the proper supervision of our children on social media, where we see the bullying that goes on, where we see children sometimes becoming suicidal or actually commit suicide because of what's happening with bullying, where we have the internet predators that are out there, and our kids become very isolated. I can tell you very quickly that in working with young people, one of the things that I see is that perhaps their social skills are not as developed as our social skills may have been coming up, because they don't have to interact as much and they live in a virtual world. And sometimes that may obscure the communications that we need to have with them as parents, especially since we don't have the skills they do on the internet. So, and with the African American community, my biggest concern is about the social stigma. But as much as we make fun of the millennials, this is a group that is actually talking about mental wellness, who talk about mental health, and I think we need to encourage that. So, like you, I'm extremely optimistic as to what we can do.
So I'm Kelli Posner, and I'm a professor at Columbia, where I run a global suicide prevention center. And I actually am the lead scientist for something called the Columbia Protocol, which is a simple set of questions that has become policy across all 50 states and many countries, and is really, in exciting ways, reducing suicide in many pockets of society, which I'll get back to why and how these are really addressable issues. And so that gives me, that enables me to be a voice for addressing stigma and misunderstanding about mental health, across the world. So I get to give the presentation to the Senate after Parkland about what we really need to do. I get the privilege of partnering with local and global communities to, how we save lives. So is this a crisis? So let me start and echo the very, very good news. There is hope, there is help. Mental health ailments like depression and anxiety are incredibly treatable. People do not have to suffer in silence. Suicide is absolutely preventable. But having said that, let me paint you the unbelievable magnitude of how big this burden is and how many people are actually touched. What do you think the largest contributor to global burden is? It's not cancer, AIDS, it's depression. Touches more people than anybody. 20% of adolescents will be diagnosed with depression. 1 out of every 4 people in this room this year will have, a treatable mental illness. And as you know, this doesn't discriminate, right? Rich, poor, black, white, popular or not. Because why? You know what the biggest cause of suicide is? This treatable medical illness called depression, but we don't think of depression like we think of cancer. You would never hear the word choice when it comes to cancer, right? And what does that lead to? This stigma and misunderstanding can literally be lethal, because people don't think about this like a chemical medical illness. I'm weak if I ask for help, snap out of it, this isn't a real illness, and guess what happens? That leads up to 75% of people who need these simple, effective medications to not get them. Guess what, 13 reasons? What does that tell you? It tells you the opposite. Right? This is a rational choice, not a chemical illness. Guess what happened the first month after the premiere? Suicide spiked, okay? Suicide is the tragic paradox that takes more firemen than fire, more police than crime, more soldiers than combat, more lives than car accidents, and 135 people are affected by every death, and these effects linger across generations because of that silence that you spoke about. But that silence that is addressable. So when we talk about should we treat this like an epidemic or a crisis, no, because that sends the wrong message. It is a crisis, but it's not. We have to get people treatment, and the more we talk about it like that, the more we can't do what we need to do to break down those barriers of stigma, and misunderstanding.
Thank you.
Hi, good evening, and thank you for inviting me this evening to talk. And my name is Jane Clemente, and I am the co-founder and now CEO of the Tyler Clemente Foundation. And I am very, very grateful to add my voice and to share a little bit about the work and the mission of the Tyler Clemente Foundation, which is to put an end to all online and offline bullying in schools, workplaces, and faith communities. And I think any conversation focused on mental health in our youth or within any community really should include a conversation about anti-bullying initiatives. For me, bullying is a very personal issue. It is something that affected our family on a very personal level. In 2010, my son Tyler Clemente was a freshman at Rutgers University, and his roommate live-streamed him in a sexual encounter with another man, and then they posted about it on social media, and Tyler continued to read those jokes and comments on social media, and his reality became very twisted and distorted, and he became very isolated. And it was at that point in time that he made a terrible decision, a decision that we can never change or undo, a terrible decision to a permanent decision, I should say, rather, to a very temporary situation. And on September 22nd, 2010, Tyler died by suicide. He was only 18 years old. And I do always like to stress that not all bullying situations end with those same tragic outcomes, but all bullying hurts at the time that it is being encountered and usually leaves lifelong lasting scars, whether physical or emotional. And it is for that reason that we started the foundation, because we don't believe anyone should ever have to experience that pain, shame, and humiliation. Whether it's a crisis, I'm not so sure. Statistics show that 20% of our youth will encounter a bullying situation in their life. That's 1 in 4. That's a pretty high number. Also, we partnered with AT&T recently, and we did a poll about online bullying specifically, and we found that we polled just 300 students here in Manhattan, actually, in New York City. I think it was all of New York City, all of the boroughs. And almost 50%, 48% said that they had already encountered some form of online harassment or bullying. So it's almost sort of not when it's going to happen or if it's going to happen, but rather when it's going to happen. And I think we just need to have these great conversations, because I think having these conversations does not increase the prevalence of these mental health situations, of depression, of bullying, of suicide, but rather it should break down those barriers and the stigma attached to it so people can get the help they need. And again, is it a crisis? Well, if even one student here at this school or one of the neighboring schools has an incident of bullying, in my opinion, that's a crisis for them. And we should all heed those warnings and make safe communities for each and every student that's enrolled in our schools. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Adam Gonzalez. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I direct behavioral health at Stony Brook University. I'm also the founding director of the Mind-Body Clinical Research Center at Stony Brook. It's really an honor to be on this panel with such an esteemed group of colleagues. And I'm really grateful to be here with all of you. Just to start, I think you all deserve a round of applause for yourselves for being here today, which really shows a commitment and dedication to your children's mental health and being willing to have this conversation. So that's really amazing. At the Mind Body Center at Stony Brook, we really try to focus on taking care of the whole person. So acknowledging that the mind and the body are interconnected. And I like to think about mental health problems really in terms of stress. So we all experience stress on varying degrees, and we want to look at the ways that we deal with stress. And not having the skills and the resources to manage stress effectively, that's where we start veering off to some of the mental health problems that we see. I want to echo some of the comments of the panelists in terms of the impact of social media. I think now more than ever, there's a lot of pressure on our youth, more personal pressure. In the past, we may have compared ourselves to, say, celebrities in magazines, and now we're making those comparisons to our peers readily, whether it be on Instagram or Snapchat. There's this pressure to be some type of perceived ideal, which is increasing more and more. And so how can we educate our youth about building their own levels of self-efficacy and confidence that they can feel secure and able to navigate the stressors that they're going to come up against. And so that's a lot of the work that we do. At Stony Brook, we also offer some specialty programs that look at the mind-body connection, so working on stress management and resilience training, as well as a program called dialectical behavior therapy, which really targets managing difficulties with emotion regulation and tolerating distress. It has been shown to be very effective with managing suicide ideation and suicidality in general. And I'm happy to talk more about those as well.
Can I just add one thing about the social media, just for a moment?
We're going to get back
okay.
to it, yes. And we've mentioned such a broad range of contributing factors here. We're talking about different identities, different cultural backgrounds. We're talking about the introduction of social media and how that changes peer interaction, peer aggression. And knowing that these are pretty much universal experiences now for this generation of young people, my question is to broaden this out a little bit. How are parents and teachers and even peers to distinguish between a young person who's having a bad day and someone who needs to have that intervention or that conversation that might lead to referral to all the types of treatments that we're talking about? And maybe the question is, maybe the answer is just have that conversation and find out, but what are really the warning signs and what's the full spectrum of possibilities there?
Right. It's a complicated question, and I do think the best answer, if we can all get there as parents, is to find out from the child. We just came from, as Maya mentioned, an hour-long conversation with some incredible students in this school, and one of the things we heard from them is kind of a fear of talking to their parents because they're afraid of how that's going to be interpreted. But they want their parents to dig in and ask those hard questions, because they said there might be several times where we're really not okay, but we're not telling our parents. So for them to probe, like, even more.
What's the reaction from the parents that they're fearing?
The reaction?
Yes.
From
They say they're afraid that they're about their parents. They don't want to ask. They don't want to say yes right away when the parents ask them if something's wrong. What do they fear provoking in their parents?
Well, I think they fear provoking disappointing their parents. That's one of many things that we talked about. Now, that said, there are definitely warning signs. I know that I made mistakes as a mom with my daughter, and the place that I made it is I didn't really understand the difference between just normal biological development of a teenager and a true warning sign. And also there are the intergenerational issues that, the way that I was brought up was very different. It was kind of the school of true grit, and you suck it up and you snap out of it and you move on. And that's not the way that this generation, is. So, just in terms of the interaction, I think there's a different way of interacting. And I would call on, Adam, I'm sure that you're studying this, but I would call on the neuroscience community really to educate us better on those warning signs. We certainly have some on our website, some Get Help Now tips. But I would also encourage parents, there's a training course called Mental Health First Aid, and it teaches you how to recognize and respond to someone in a mental health or a substance abuse crisis. It's incredible. I've taken it. Many of us have taken it. We've also adapted a teen version. So 10th through 12th graders can learn how to recognize and respond when a peer is actually in a crisis. But directly to your question, there's very clear warning signs. Everything from your grades slipping, spending more time in your room, feeling isolated, more agitation. There's a number, but a number of them. I'm not the expert, which is why I would encourage, taking a class like Mental Health First Aid.
Just building off that, and I feel like I just want to, as a parent, I just want to photocopy these notes from this last class and just like circulate it. So every time I'm asked a question, I'm just gonna say what the kids told me because it's just so important. Also, my children are 4 and 7, so I am nailing it so far. But for those of you who may not be having as easy of a time as I am, we did a research study, a diary study, where we dug into the difference between how kids believe their parents are talking to them about mental health and how parents believe they're talking to their kids about mental health. So we asked parents for a 2-week period to talk about their interactions that day, how they had supported and cultivated their young people's mental health, and the parents overwhelmingly gave themselves A's. They too were nailing it. The kids, in every case, said that their parent had not spoken to them about mental health, right? The parents said, I asked them how their days were, right? And the kids said, they asked me to be vulnerable without themselves showing me their vulnerability, right? So we learned 2 big things from that piece of research. First, we are not modeling the behavior that we're asking of our children, right? My children are in San Francisco. I go to New York City every week. I'm the executive director of this foundation, and Instagram game is so strong. I spend so much time acting as though I have it figured out.
Yeah.
That when then I ask Hunter why he got into an altercation with the kid, I have never once, I have, but I don't as often as I should, apologize to him. Talk about the times that mommy's failed. Talk about the times that I've struggled. So that was number 2. And then the second thing was that young people felt judged. And upstairs, over and over again, we heard a couple quick things. First, the young people in the room felt like their parents equated their mental health struggles with you having failed, us having failed as parents, right? If my kid is having a hard time with their mental health, then I've done something wrong. And then we get resistant, right? We try and look to see what we've done wrong instead of understanding the experience that our kid is having. And then the secondary piece, and I think this is really important in a place as international, I grew up here, I'm in New York City. You should certainly let your kids date anyone they want except geographically. I broke my heart, I met my mom's heart, I live in California now because I met a boy, so regulate that piece, because this is the best city in the world. But what we heard over and over again was that there was this competing trauma, right? So a young person was coming home today, and they'd say like, Anya and I got in a fight, and they'd be like, in my parents' example, my parents would be like, we sought political asylum from Romania. We slept 12 to a room. I gave up everything for you to go to that school, and you want to come home and you want to complain that you and Anya got in a fight, right? And that feels so real, both to the parent, but then shut it down for the kid, right? So those were for me as a parent, and for me as leading this foundation with Cynthia, those were 2 of the biggest learnings that, again, were echoed upstairs that I want to share here in the room.
Thank you. It's really powerful.
So I think we heard some of the key indicators, maybe even the silent indicators that something is going on with your child, where you should look at getting a mental health referral, the isolation, the anger. We also know, of course, the disrupted sleep cycles, anxiety, in addition to that depression, is epidemic with our kids now. And with that anxiety, we see the nervousness, the doubting of their own skills and intelligence, putting themselves down, feeling that they can't get into a particular school, when in fact they're doing quite well. But I would say that it's very important to not have a boundary between, okay, should my kid see a mental health expert or not, depending on what's going on. If you suspect anything at all, or if your child asks, that's part of really getting rid of that, that mental health barrier, the stigmas that we see, because there's absolutely nothing wrong in your child seeing a mental health expert, in talking to a school counselor. As a matter of fact, it's mandatory in my home that as they get annual checkups, they also get a mental health checkup. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that child getting therapy, because not only does it make them better if something is going on emotionally, but it increases their social IQ, because they have someone to speak to. So that's how we get rid of that stigma. So please, it's important that you understand that it's not just about whether my child has a mental health problem or does not, but what can we do to enhance who this child is through music lessons, through counseling, through all sorts of extracurricular activities that address mental wellness and mental health.
So in terms of warning signs, so I was the head of diagnostics and child psychiatry at Columbia, and I think the biggest thing that we learned we needed to clarify a lot is that in teenagers specifically, depression can look very different. One of the gating criteria is sad or irritable mood. So is your kid angry, cranky, disrespectful? I know I just described every teenager probably that we have, but for prolonged periods of times. You guys have heard of, oppositional defiant disorder. So people often mistake that. You can't even get that if it's in the context of depression, because that's actually what depression looks like. Do they have loss of interest or pleasure? Do they, are they eating, sleeping, suicidal thoughts, low feelings of, self-worth, for prolonged periods of time, not just in a day. But the other thing I'd say is that in terms of warning signs, 50% of people who die by suicide have seen their primary care doctor the month before they die. We should be asking the way we monitor for blood pressure. Do you know many adolescents who show up to the emergency department who have tried to take their own lives are not there for psychiatric reasons? So if we're not asking everybody the way we talk about a sprained ankle, we are not going to find the people suffering in silence. And what we know is that when people or kids are suffering, they actually want help and they want to be asked. And the reason the Columbia Protocol has had the impact it has is because parents didn't know what questions to ask. They didn't know what to do with the answers. They didn't know if it was going to cause somebody to be suicidal. And that's broken down all those barriers. But the other thing we've learned is that there's also this false assumption that people will necessarily have the will to come in that kind of pain to come to the doctor. So what we've learned in our national efforts with all the national agencies is that we must actually go ask and find people and kids where they work, live, and thrive, right? Before if they ever get to a doctor. So parent, coach, teacher, who can be equipped with ways to identify people that are suffering in silence. And the last thing I'd say is that this is also a way, when you ask and you don't have the stigma surrounding it, it's a way to connect. The CDC tells us that connection is one of the most important things we need to do to prevent suicide. And lest you doubt the impact of that, do you know there's a study showing that the opposite of connectedness or feeling connected, loneliness, is equivalent to 15 cigarettes a day. More lethal than heart disease or obesity. The simple potency in just asking and being direct and not being brought down by that stigma.
So as it would relate to bullying or anti-bullying and cyberbullying specifically, to speak to what you were saying, Cynthia, about not telling parents, part of that poll we also asked if those 50% of those students who were already targeted, if they had told their parents or would tell their parents, and it was really profoundly a no. 80% said they wouldn't. And one of the main reasons that we found that is because they were afraid that their parents would take the devices away from them. Right. And in this day and age, it's not reality to keep or take the devices away. They need to get out of that platform for sure while they're being harassed, but you need to come up with a plan on how you're going to address it. Just take a device away is not the answer to a cyberbullying incident. You need to definitely come up with a plan, address how you're going to block the person, how you're going to, if it's a classmate that's doing it, address it maybe by bringing it to the attention of the teachers in the schools. But you definitely cannot just expect to take the device away. That's an important idea for you to definitely hold on to. As well as depending on what age you are allowing your child to connect in the cyber world. With that poll that we did that I was telling you about, there are children as young as 3 years old that are using devices that can connect to the internet without any security measures or parental guidance restrictions on those devices. That's a scary thought for me anyway, because I'm not from this generation. I'm old, and this is all pre-me, for sure. This is not how I grew up, for sure. So you definitely can have parental guidance and restrictions on devices that you give your children, but as you start to allow them into this cyber world, it's sort of like driving a car. You don't just hand over the keys and let the youth take the car around the block. You have education around it, you have in-classroom, you have driver's ed behind the wheel, you go for a year with a registration. So my suggestion is to use the internet the same way. It's a powerful tool. It can be used for good, or it can be used as a weapon of great harm and destruction, as in the case of my son and many, many other young people today. But there are platforms that you go on together as families. You certainly should be reviewing your child's phone if they're 5, 6, 7, 10 years old, even 12. And as they are more comfortable and you're more confident and you've built up that trust, they get more privileges. It seems like a logical step-by-step activity to do. I think also it's important to know that looking for signs and warning signs are really important, but not everyone has the same symptoms, for sure. And some people exhibit no symptoms at all. We did not see any symptoms in my son, Tyler. Matter of fact, it was just the opposite. He was actually a really good-natured, easygoing child that always woke up with a smile on his face. But in hindsight, looking back, he had also learned to hide himself for a very long time. When he did finally come out to us just 2 days before going to college, not a really big leeway to really adjust to this situation, he had said he had known since middle school. So he had been hiding that for many years before he came out. And I do believe he hid his mental health status from us as well. Waking up every day with that smile, I think it was easier to hide behind that smile than to hide behind a frown. And you get less questions probably asked. So certainly if you're on your child's device, on their iPad or computer or phone, and you see something that doesn't feel right, you definitely have to have conversations, have those difficult conversations, come up with a plan as to how you're going to deal with it. And it's different with each child and who you're going to ban. And it's important to just look outwardly and make sure that we have those conversations not only with your child, but as you're carpooling, or probably in the city you don't carpool so much, but the best time was when I would carpool and I would listen to my sons and their friends talking, because I learned much more from listening and eavesdropping than I did from our communications together.
Yeah, I think it can be really challenging when I think kids can put up a front and hide their symptoms, so it can be challenging as parents to really be aware and mindful about what differences are occurring. Many moons ago, as a graduate student, I did mental health interviews with children about their own mental health, and then would interview their parent about what the parent's perception was. And it was amazing to see how some parents got it completely wrong and had no idea what was going on for the kid. And then it was also really amazing to see parents that knew exactly what was going on, and you could see that level of connection there between the parent and the child. I think, as a summary of the panel, I think it was pretty consistent. Having that open communication is really important, that there's also these generational differences as well. So being comfortable with talking about emotions, and what are emotions, how can we identify those? At 1 year old, my sister would ask my niece, "Are you feeling happy? Are you feeling sad? Are you feeling angry?" And just a couple weeks ago, she's now 2.5, and she looked sad to me. So I said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "I'm sad." And I said, "Why are you sad?" Because I couldn't have a cookie. So we talked about why she couldn't have a cookie right now, and when she could have that cookie. So it's really amazing to see, even at a very young age, at like 2.5, that kids can start identifying their own emotions and being emotionally intelligent. So having those conversations early on is really important. The last thing I wanted to mention about, in terms of symptoms, sometimes just putting up a front, but also hiding symptoms. So especially in youth, non-suicidal self-injury can be common, and what that means is engaging in behaviors like cutting, burning, maybe even pulling hair out, skin picking. So being aware of what your kids might be covering up and being mindful of that as well. People can sometimes engage in those behaviors as a way to help regulate emotions, which is not helpful. So being mindful of different types of clothing that your kids might not usually wear can also be helpful there.
It's really eye-opening. Thank you all so much for sharing. And there's just one thing I want to add that's a take-home message from me from what you're all saying is about parents as role models and sharing our own vulnerability. Because I've done a lot of writing about the performance of parenting online and social media and Instagram moms and all of that. And you know, we're always told as parents that we're supposed to be enjoying every minute of it, and I think we get very practiced in hiding our emotions from our children and acting like we're happy. And so that sets up this front where, of course, we don't want to burden our children overwhelmingly, but to be able to talk about the fact that we're seeking help or that we are struggling with something, it sounds like would be amazing in terms of opening up the conversation. And so I do want to get to our students' questions because, I mean, they've been so great throughout this. I was handed these questions that were coming from the students here. And the first two are kind of two halves of the same coin, which is parents being afraid to seek professional help for their children. And then how do you talk to a student who doesn't want to get professional help or go to a therapist or admit that something's wrong? So would you all be able to speak to those two sides? Maybe we could reverse the order.
Sure. Yeah, I can start. I think one fear maybe, and you may know better than us as parents, is the fear of having your child on medication. I know that comes up a lot with parents. And so I think going back to sometimes medication is helpful and is needed, just as if you had diabetes or high blood pressure, you would be prescribed medication to help deal with that. And as Cynthia mentioned, in terms of like neuroscience, biology is important to consider. So there is good research to look at the biological underpinnings of mental health diseases as well. So sometimes medication is helpful. It's not always the answer because there are good psychotherapeutic techniques and empirically supported treatments that can be really helpful for managing some of these mental health conditions that we see. So seeking treatment, I think, can be really useful, but there's also some fears that come up as well.
And just to add to that, so that's what we were talking about thinking about this like a chemical illness, like a brain-based illness that runs in families, that's genetic. You know how depression works? We have a natural neurotransmitter called serotonin, which controls mood and sleep. So medications like Prozac and Paxil, they're called serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So they just make it so you have the appropriate amount of serotonin, your natural serotonin, in your system, right? We know since we have these antidepressants, the suicide rate has dropped dramatically across the world, across ages, reversing a trend prior to their introduction. And if you had asthma, you'd have an inhaler. And if you had, an infection, you'd have an antibiotic. But like I said before, up to 75% of people who need these medications don't get them. Purely, we know, because of that stigma and not thinking about this like the chemical illness that it is. And I just wanted to add to that in terms of, what parents are afraid of. And I want to kind of give the full picture, and everything is so valid, but social media isn't as cut and dry as that. When you look at both sides, so yes, we need moderation. Vulnerable kids, have particular vulnerability to it. But did you also know that it is one of the #1 suicide prevention tools? Just like it's the #1 prevention, reduction of teen pregnancy and drug abuse. Because you get that immediate peer-to-peer, you get immediate, treatment information. So I think we have to make sure to understand that social media doesn't cause suicide, but these are all contributing factors that we need to be aware of.
Well, first of all, I admire you so darn much. I actually did many stories on your son in the news, and the situations that led up to his tragic death. So thank you very much for making it your mission that he did not die in vain, that you have saved so many lives. So thank you for that very much.
I think it's really important when we know that our children can benefit from medication, that we take them to health providers, whether it's a psychiatric nurse practitioner or a psychiatrist or a pediatrician, who has the bedside manner to be able to work with that child, who can sit and spend the time with that youngster to get to know them before talking about what they think the medication needs to be able to communicate with them as to what have they tried in order to do better as far as their mental wellness, who's willing to talk to them about, okay, we can try the medications, because the medications can be life-saving, right? And let's face it, a lot of us have issues perhaps with even admitting that our children may have a mental health challenge. Not my child, not in my backyard. I can't believe this is happening with my child. But if we're able to break out of that denial and to be strong and to be courageous and spiritual and brave, we can save our children. And the quicker that we get them that treatment, the better it will be for that child. So we have to believe in what it is that we're asking them to do. We have to be with them every step of the way when they're if they get the medication. And by the way, no child should be on psychiatric medications without also getting counseling. We should be with them when they go get that counseling. We should ask them about it. We should reinforce and give them praise for being courageous and being able to do this, because there's this thing called peer pressure. And sometimes our kids are they're very resilient, but they're also very resistant. They don't want to be different from their friends. They don't want to be on a medication that sometimes has side effects. And let's face it, even us as adults, right? Whether we're taking medication for hypertension or some other medical issue, as soon as we start feeling better, what do? We start letting that medication go. We don't take it as much. We skip the medication. Oh, I can get through this hypertension with just a Peloton. Well, actually, I thought I could. And it worked for a while, and then I had to go back on the medication, but still keep working out, right? But it's important that you have the consistency in working with your child and saying, okay, let's address this every single day. And it's not just about medication. It's not just about therapy, but it's also about exercise. It's also about us taking family vacations. It's also about reassurance. It's also about love. And it's also about, it's a family project, not just something that our child is going through, and get them to the experts, let them take care of it, and we'll get the reports from those providers. But be involved in every way. And finally, being able to, as we talked about, admitting that we have our own mental health issues and that some of this stuff may be genetic. Look, I'm just going to be completely honest with you. I always am. I'm dealing with generalized anxiety, hypochondriasis, OCD, and lo and behold, maybe we can do an experiment with this doctor as to whether it's about the environment, whether they see me checking the stove to make sure that the gas is off all the time, and it happens to be an electric stove, so don't get me started, right? But whether they see that kind of behavior
and maybe, you know, they engage in that a little bit, but I do believe that there is a genetic predisposition, and I have several of my children are dealing with high anxiety. So to be able to tell them, yes, this is the treatment I had gotten, and we're going to help you so that you can be as strong as you can be, and there's absolutely, absolutely nothing wrong in getting help.
If I could just jump in quick, I think that's one of the best things that you can do for your kids is to take care of your own mental health, and being mindful of when it's time for you to seek care as well. We always use the analogy of the flight attendants talking about putting on the oxygen mask. So it's super important that we take care of our own mental health before we can take care of our kids' mental health.
That's right.
Yeah. The other thing, I think you bring up such an important point, like physical health isn't episodic, right? When I was pregnant, I got this kind of care, and then prenatal, and now we go back to whatever the annual checkups are, and I go to the dentist. We treat mental health in times of crisis, right? We're not proactive and like habitual about it, right?
Yes.
So of course it's weird when we have a medication because we haven't talked about it in good times. So it's only linked to when something's broken, right? And I think that's also in the delivery of service. I had really severe postpartum depression, and every time I would call my doctor, they'd say, do you want to harm yourself or the baby? Or do you want, you know, this antidepressant, right? Those are like the two extremes. And there was nothing in between. There was no conversation unless you were in crisis. And I think the other thing, when we sat down upstairs, a young woman, it got to the point where like, what do you want us to tell the parents? And she goes, parents, get uncomfortable. And I was like, yes, girl,
Right.
like, yes. And she said, the world is such a scary place. And she talked about the young black women that have been going missing lately. And she said, I know it's a scary place, but I can feel your fear, right? I feel your fear in how you talk to me. I feel your fear in how you parent me. I feel your fear in how you talk about me and my future, right? And that's such a real thing. Because when I was 7, the age of my oldest kid, my parents would just say, like, come home when the sun goes down, right? Not for 5 minutes in this affluent suburb would I let him out of my sight, because I know so much more now. But how that impacts our kids' anxiety and how they view the world. This one young woman said, there's so little trust in the world, and all we have left is our parents, right? So if you fear and distrust the world, I mean, and Anya and I worked together in civic engagement in a past life, trust in our institutions is at an all-time low, right? We don't believe anyone for anything, and that's irregardless of anything that is happening in this moment. That didn't start now, that didn't start in the last presidency, that's been building for a long time. So these kids just feel this pervasive lack of trust from us, and how that affects us in how we get help for them, how we listen to them, how we parent them. Like, again, 4 and 7, I don't know yet. You guys figure it out and then let me know. But I feel like that just needs to be said.
Yeah, but the interesting thing about that conversation we had is the youth said it came out of the protective nature of their parents that were just trying to protect them. I mean, we had one young man who said that he had never been to a party and that he'd never been out past 11 o'clock at night because his mother had instilled a fear in him he was a young black man, and instilled a fear in him of what would happen or potentially could happen if we went out. So I kind of call this the two-way fear, because the fear that the parents felt was causing fear and anxiety, in the youth. The other just comment I wanted to make, kind of building off of what a couple of people said, was the association between physical and mental health. Just an example might be my daughter herself, who has both a mental illness and chronic physical pain. People that have mental illness are at a high risk for developing physical pain of some sort, and vice versa. people with physical chronic pain are at a high risk of developing a mental illness. So, we work very hard and I work very hard in another role that I have at parity, at ensuring that we take care of physical health the same way that we do mental health.
At the risk of being a broken record, it's very important to communicate to our children that it's a sign of strength to seek help. And also to echo what you said, that many kids have no symptoms at all, and they suffer in silence, and you can't rely on any warning sign, which means we have to treat this matter-of-factly, asking all the time and not being afraid of it, so we can connect the right people to the care they need.
But also, because you brought up African American children, that's a population we're really missing as to what's going on, where we're seeing record rates of suicide amongst young black men, where we're seeing record rates of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so when we go through the inner city, we're not going to have, for example, young black men saying, I'm really feeling anxious, or, I'm really feeling hopeless right now, or I'm really feeling depressed. What we may see is some of that isolation, some of the anger, some of the just keeping a lot of information to themselves because, again, of the stigma of talking about not just mental health challenges, but also of appearing weak. And if you appear weak in some of these environments, then you're in bigger trouble as far as bullying and psychological issues. So when they see, they don't even have to be victims of violence. They see poverty. They see other people who are victims of violence. They see it on television. They see it in the neighborhoods where there's police brutality and there were issues with stop and frisk. All of those things are drastically increasing the anxiety levels of many of our children, but our children of color. So for those of you who work with children of color, those of you who are teachers and mental health professionals, be aware that what you see on the outside may not really be indicative of the turmoil that's inside, and that's why you have to ask about it.
Directly.
And for those of you who don't have children of color, you just have your children of whatever background, religion, race, or what have you, you have to teach your children the empathy to be able to understand the suffering of others, because that will increase their mental wellness to know what's happening with other people.
Absolutely. I really want to get our audience into this conversation. I just feel like I have to mention, because we haven't, that access to professional help is not equally available to all communities, right?
Health disparities.
And so we have to think about the role of our public schools in this. Many times it might fall on churches, and so it's not as easy as overcoming resistance. Sometimes you have to find a therapist who takes public insurance. But that said, please give your questions in the form of a question. You can make statements later, perhaps amongst yourselves. And we've got someone passing around a microphone. Okay, great.
Thank you all so much. Over the vacation, I read Under Pressure by Lisa D'Amour because I have twin daughters who are in 10th grade. And I feel that young women are facing very different anxieties than young men. And, there was a fascinating passage about how the next generation is learning about sex through pornography online, which kind of horrified me. But I wanted to ask, when you feel that your children are suffering from worry, pressures of, application processes for college, or getting on a team, or having a crush that's not returned, there's sort of this delicate balance because they have their privacy, and yet at the same time, there's sort of the sleuthing that parents can do, check out the Instagram, try to get tidbits. I mean, how how direct and how hard do we push when we do get the pushback? No, it's fine, I'm fine. No, everything's fine. Really, it's totally fine. Like, what is that? Is it different for everyone, or should we really push and say, you know what, we're gonna sit down and put the phones away? I mean, I'm gonna kidnap you, we're gonna go have a coffee and talk. Like, how far should we push?
One of the young women upstairs said that parents ask the most general questions, right? She said, you come home and your parents ask you how your day was, and you say fine, and they say great, as if they had like checked a box, right? And so we said to her, like, it's not enough to just suggest a problem, like, what's your solution to that? What would be better? And she said, I would love for my mom to ask me, tell me one good thing that happened today. And if I pause, if I have a hard time finding something, if I'm repeating the same thing every day, right? That's a signal. So the specificity of our questions, I think, is really important. And then my husband, bless his heart, he asks me, do you want me to fix or listen? Which, like, when you're spun up is actually even worse, right? I would want you to know if I want you to fix or listen, right? But at the root of that question, right, is the recognition that sometimes we automatically jump into one or the other, right? And the pause to ask and the opportunity to reflect, I actually need this problem solved because it's with a teacher, right? And I need you to come in and deal with that versus I'm just having a hard time with this girl in school and I just want you to listen. Those, I think, are the two tidbits that I have.
And I mean, I would vote for some form of kidnapping, like you said. Right?
Kidnapping.
Like whether it's coffee, it could be the family dinner that we're not always eating at together. Take an interest, right? Spend some time and in a safe environment where they will open up. I mean, we are huge proponents of family dinners because they actually are predictors of positive mental health. They're predictors of, believe it or not, voting among youth. So that's a great way, but I would vote for that and just create, and a lot of the youth said that as well, just spending more time with their parents would possibly help them to open up more.
So I would just add two important things. You can believe them when they say it's okay, because most of the time when people are suffering, they actually want help. And the other very important thing to know is you need to ask directly and not shy away. Again, that's why these Columbia questions have had such impact, because it's directly asking about suicidal ideation and actions and identifying who actually are those few rare people that actually are at risk. And we've just learned countless times that asking directly is all upside, and when people are suffering, that's what you need to do.
On asking directly, and we said this with the kids, I hope you guys already know this, asking someone if they are thinking of taking their own life does not give them the idea to do that.
That's right.
You have to, I hope nobody in this room is worried on that level, but if you are, or you know someone that is, the direct question of, are you thinking of taking your life, or do you harm yourself, will help save a life. It will not put the idea in anyone's head.
Exactly. And the questions are in your yellow bags, all in there, the actual direct questions that people are using to their kids and everywhere else to actually save lives.
Medication. Thank you. So therapy, medication, and parenting, and you get to a point where you don't necessarily see the medication actually improving your child's well-being. What's next? What's cutting edge?
Well, I would say, first of all, it's not so much a science as an art, combination, and you want to find a good psychopharmacologist who understands how to optimize. But I would also say, like we all said, that the combination of psychotherapy, and for anxiety, for example, which touches 34% of teens, one of the most treatable, psychotherapy, CBT, is actually even more effective than medication, and we know the combination is there. And then when you have good providers that understand all the things that contribute to an optimal treatment, like DBT, multifamily groups where the family can work on the parenting issues that contribute to the mental health issues, right? Is you always just want to be the connoisseur and push the envelope with your providers and track, you know, where improvement or worsening is happening.
And just to clarify, so CBT stands for cognitive behavioral therapy, and then the DBT is dialectical behavior therapy. So it's also important to know what type of treatment that your kid may be engaged in with a therapist, and doing some of that legwork to look at what types of treatments are best suited for what types of problems that your child might be presenting with. So not every therapist is going to practice in the same way. So being aware of what type of interventions they're participating in, what's their training background. So cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the most well-supported type of psychotherapy treatments. And exposure-based therapy actually for anxiety disorders is super effective for panic attacks, OCD. Other types of interventions would be mindfulness-based interventions. So you may have heard of mindfulness. It's all about being in the present moment in a non-judgmental way. So how can we appreciate the now? Because when we are stuck in the past and ruminating, or in the future and worrying, that's where we see a lot of the emotional pain come up versus being in the here and now.
And just to add to the cutting edge, there's something called safety planning, which has an app which gives all of you, you know, coping mechanisms for your kids that came out of the treatment of adolescent suicide attempters, NIMH study. So there's a toolkit of things that really are cutting edge that can help.
We had a question here.
Thank you guys all for coming. It's been really informative. I am a youth advisor at The Door, which is a homeless and at-risk drop-in center. And speaking more to what you were saying, Jeffrey, I do a movie night for them about once a month. And over the last 4 years, I've noticed a tremendous uptick in the Black community with irritability, seeming depressive episodes, anxiety over some of the films I've been showing. And when they come to me and ask me, you know, if I have resources, even though The Door has so many resources, I'm just wondering if any of you have any resources that I could recommend that are low budget, low cost, no cost to some of these teenagers, because I don't have that information to give.
Well, offline, we could talk later about the clinic with which I work, because we have a sliding scale. If the parent doesn't have a particular insurance or no insurance, they will actually sign them up for insurance. So they'll find a way. We turn no one away. They will find a way to get the proper services for whomever the person may be. And by the way, your organization is absolutely terrific. You guys have been around a long time. You've done great work. The bad news is that we're seeing this uptick in the Black community. The good news is that they're talking about it. Absolutely.
I would look at the Ali Forney Center too. The Ali Forney Center, ALIFORNEY. They're the largest LGBT youth homeless shelter in the country, and they're here in New York City. And they have unbelievable resources that they connect their young people to, and have this amazing network of clinicians that offer their services.
Okay. Hi, good evening. I want to know, what advice do you have for young couples who have two very different parenting styles? And kids are so smart and they can pick it up. So I wanted to hear from you.
Oh, I wish I knew.
We, in our household, I'm very, let's talk about it, and my husband is very, old school New York. No, he's gonna figure it out. I had to figure it out. He has to figure it out. And sometimes your child is there in the kitchen, and he's like, well, I know how to get what I want when I want, because I see mommy's vulnerable and daddy is vulnerable.
Yep. So, I mean, I can bring that back to mental health from personal experience. One of my 4 kids, who was the kid who was born with depression, starting at age 7, and my husband is more, discipline, and I'm like, and we'd have to work through and say, this isn't a discipline issue, this is a therapeutic issue. A kid that has a broken arm can't throw a baseball, and really educating and to come towards the middle, to have the appropriate. And then when they're out of an illness, what I did was I'd still be in that protective, and they didn't want that. I want to have the right boundaries, so you learn about what is right for what time and how it interacts with those particular issues.
I think, so anecdotally, that's how my household was, right? And I, in both of those experiences, learned so much about how I want to and how I don't want to show up in the world. And they never blamed each other. It was just 2 examples, right? So I knew who I could go to, and I knew who I couldn't, right? So I would just ask you, and not to get into your marriage dynamics, to find the strength to keep saying, we have to listen, right? Because your kid needs to hear that their voice is valid and that there's a place to go to hear that voice, just as your husband's entitled to his opinions. My parents for my entire life, but just my mom continued. I knew that when I needed it, I remembered those kitchen conversations that she believed that I needed to be listened to.
I just want to mention, this goes beyond your situation, right? I surveyed hundreds of parents for my book, The Art of Screen Time, and there's so many people co-parenting in 2 different households with totally different sets of ideas about mental health, right? Also, if you're someone who's open to be asked as a parent, you're also going to have to be available to your kids' friends, because you might be that one mom who's askable. My husband's mother is a therapist, and she was that mom. So, power to you if you can be that askable parent, even if you're the only one on the block. There's time for 2 more questions.
I just wanted to ask, how much information is too much information to give to our kids? Because in being a parent of an African-American child and seeing all these young teenagers that are being kidnapped, disappearing, and young girls, and my daughter is 15, and I worry, and I make her aware, so I'm pushing on my stress to her, and she becomes stressed. So then sometimes I don't want her to go out, and then I'm tracking her and all that kind of stuff. So how much information is too much information?
I would say to think that they don't already know, right? And we have instantaneous, immediate access to everything. Everything. There's nothing that kids don't find out, whether they look or not, right? One young woman upstairs apologized that she doesn't read the newspaper every day. I was like, yeah, me too. I'm so sorry about that. But so I would say what you worry them with versus what you assume they know are different things. I would assume they know it. And then if you have an entrance, if they give you an entrance to to talk about it, then go there. But I would assume more often than not that they know.
We actually just did this story for National Public Radio, and the response that we got was, just open the conversation with, what have you heard about X?
Right.
Right? Have you heard that there's, I want you to know that there's not a draft, it's not World War III, for example, but tell me what you've heard and what people are saying.
And your kids will tell you when they've had enough. They use the great word, ooh, right? But, you have to look at the age. And don't be afraid. You have to be bold to give them information, but not to scare them, but to inform them. And it may be uncomfortable for them, but for most of us as parents, it's uncomfortable for us to discuss some of these situations. A study was just done, and I'm sure you're aware of it, where they found that pregnancy rates and rates with regard to actual sexuality and intercourse are starting to drop in New York. Why? Because there's so much information on the internet. Some of the things that we feared, right? It's an information highway, who's regulating, but those kids are on there and they're getting all of the information that we as parents are afraid to give them about sexuality.
And I just wanted to add, there's not necessarily ever too much information, but it has to be the right kind of information. So what we know from the media guidelines, for example, is every time you talk about depression or suicide, depression is treatable, suicide is preventable. When you speak about it in this glorifying way or gory details, that's what causes contagion. So as long as we keep those messages and we're communicating the right information, then that's what's most important.
Right.
Okay, we have one more question. Yes? Yes.
I have a question. I don't know if they connect, because growing up, I always say I didn't know that I was poor until I got older, because the whole community itself, like growing up, we played outside. You know, we were rollerblading, skating, you know, swimming and all these things. And I noticed is that with my daughter, she's 17 years old, when she gets with her friend, they go to the mall and they sit in a corner and look at Instagram, look at TikTok, and look at all these things. And it's just like, I hear you guys saying about mental illness, about the medication and canceling, but what about the fitness aspect of it? Like, you know, exercising as well as social media, because they just sit there and just see what else is out there and comparing themselves, and they want to look like girls who don't even look like that, you know, with the whole surgery and everything like that. So it's just...
Sure. And I did mention the importance of exercise for our children, that you have to look at a multi-pronged approach to increasing their mental health, whether it's spiritual, whether it's physical. One of the things that we don't do enough of, because our kids, when we say, hey, let's take a field trip, let's go out this afternoon, let's go you know, to an estate sale, one of the first things they'll tell you is, nah, that's okay, I'd rather stay home, work on the tablet or the computer. We force our kids to go with us when we're in Westchester, when we're out, when we're doing things, and now they actually go with us. And we don't have to lay down rules about, well, you can't bring your tablet or whatever. Fine, look at the tablet in the car, but once we get out of the car, you can't keep walking around with it because you'll drop it or what have you. But it really is about getting them more engaged in social type situations, inviting friends over, their friends. Get to know who their friends are. Get to know who the parents of their friends are. Have little get-togethers. When you do that, you're teaching them how to be social. You're teaching them about social IQ. You're teaching them about empathy. You're teaching them how to be human, because we are really starting to lose that now, especially when we look at AI, artificial intelligence. You know, I have more conversations with Siri, you know, than I used to have with my kids, but we have to change that.
But it's very important to understand that those are additive things. They can't be in isolation. Like if you had asthma, you would need that inhaler. Exercise wouldn't do it, right? So with these chemical illnesses that we're talking about, you need those evidence-based treatments, and all these other things also help, you know, boost health and well-being.
Okay. Is that, yes, I want to thank our panelists so much.
And I just want to take the opportunity to thank the people who put this together, and also not forget the students that aren't here, but the 30 students that showed up today and spent some time talking from the adults from Born This Way in an honest and vulnerable way. And we hope they continue that. This conversation will continue certainly through Lamont. We have mental health professionals in our schools, so if families want more information, there's some information that's been provided in the bags here, but I want to thank Anya and the panelists for their knowledge, their varied experiences and areas of expertise, and coming here to share with our parents. So we're so appreciative. Thank you so much. And thank you, all of you, for taking the time to come to participate in this conversation. That's another step towards mental well-being. So thank you, and have a safe trip home. Thank you.